Have you ever felt that strange and unsettling confusion when a woman in your life suddenly transforms before your eyes? One moment connected, the next, distant and unreachable. Today, you're about to discover what Carl Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, revealed about the hidden forces driving the feminine psyche. Forces so powerful they can make even the most loving woman sabotage her deepest connections. The pain you've experienced isn't random. That bewildering moment when she pulled away, when her eyes changed, when her words contradicted everything she'd said before. It wasn't just emotional chaos. It was an ancient psychological pattern unfolding, one that Jung spent decades mapping in the female unconscious. Men suffer silently with this confusion. You analyze conversations endlessly, question your actions, wonder if you're fundamentally unlovable. You blame yourself for not understanding signals that seem to change without warning. This invisible wound cuts deeper than rejection. It's the pain of feeling perpetually mystified by the woman you care about most. But there is a solution, and it begins with understanding what Jung called the shadow loop, the unconscious cycle where a woman's repressed aspects hijack her authentic desires. By the end of our journey today, you'll recognize these patterns with such clarity that what once seemed like emotional chaos will transform into a map you can navigate with confidence. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, isn't simply negativity. It's everything a woman has been taught to reject about herself. Think about the little girl told to be nice when she felt angry, to look pretty when she wanted to be powerful, to care for others when she needed care herself. These rejected parts don't disappear. They go underground. You've witnessed this shadow erupting in relationships. Remember when she suddenly became cold after showing vulnerability? Or when a minor criticism triggered disproportionate rage? That wasn't her being irrational. It was her shadow breaking through her conscious identity. Jung discovered that women in particular struggle with shadows related to power, aggression, and self-prioritization. Society rewards the nurturing, emotionally available woman while punishing the ambitious, boundary-setting one. The result? Millions of women with deeply repressed anger and power drives that emerge in relationships as passive aggression, emotional withdrawal, or sudden inexplicable mood shifts. Have you noticed how these shadow eruptions follow patterns? They're often triggered at moments of deepening intimacy or when you make requests. This isn't coincidence. It's the shadow protecting old wounds. One of Jung's most profound insights was his discovery of the animus, the unconscious masculine element within every woman. This isn't simply how she sees men. It's a complex inner figure shaped by her father, male teachers, cultural images of masculinity, and collective psychological inheritance. When a woman's animus is wounded or undeveloped, it profoundly distorts her perception of you. You could say the most supportive words, yet she hears criticism. You could offer genuine help, yet she perceives control. You're not imagining this, she's literally experiencing you through the filter of her animus. Think of recent arguments that seem to come from nowhere. Perhaps you made a suggestion about something practical, and suddenly she accused you of thinking she's incompetent. This isn't manipulation. She genuinely experiences your comment through her animus's interpretation. Her inner masculine aspect, if negative, will transform your words before they even reach her conscious mind. This negative animus often speaks to her in critical inner dialogue. You're not enough. He'll leave you eventually. You can't trust him. The cruel irony. She believes these thoughts originate from her intuition about you, rather than recognizing them as projections from within. Jung's revolutionary insight was that certain psychological patterns are universal, embedded in what he called the collective unconscious. These archetypes manifest distinctly in the feminine psyche, creating predictable relationship dynamics you've likely encountered without recognizing their deeper meaning. The maiden archetype seeks protection and validation, appearing as vulnerability that can quickly transform into helplessness or dependency. You've seen this when she seems unable to make decisions without your input, yet resents you for providing direction. The mother archetype compels nurturing, sometimes to the point of self-erasure. Have you noticed how she might care for everyone else's needs while neglecting her own, then resent you for not somehow forcing her to prioritize herself? The queen archetype demands recognition and authority. This emerges when she seems hypersensitive to any perceived disrespect, requiring acknowledgement in ways that might seem excessive until you understand the archetypal need driving it. The mystic archetype seeks meaning beyond the material world. This appears when she suddenly questions the entire relationship during periods of spiritual exploration or existential reflection. When these archetypes operate unconsciously, they create confusing behaviors. A woman might swing between maiden vulnerability and queen assertiveness in the span of hours, leaving you wondering who exactly you're in relationship with. The answer? All of these aspects exist within her simultaneously, emerging in response to different triggers. Now we arrive at the central mechanism Jung identified, the shadow loop. This isn't just occasional emotional reactivity, it's a self-perpetuating cycle that repeats with eerie precision. The loop functions like this. A woman carries unacknowledged wounds, often from childhood. These wounds create expectations of being hurt again. Her negative animus constantly scans for evidence confirming these fears. When normal relationship challenges arise, this negative animus distorts your words and actions to fit the expected pattern of hurt. She then reacts to this distortion, rather than to what actually happened. Most critically, the shadow loop creates what Jung called repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar, painful situations. Have you noticed how the same fundamental conflict keeps emerging in different forms? How certain conversations feel like you're trapped in a script neither of you wrote? That's the shadow loop at work. The woman in your life isn't choosing this pattern consciously. In fact, she's often as confused by her reactions as you are. She genuinely doesn't understand why she feels threatened by your success, why your need for space triggers abandonment panic, or why your expressions of love sometimes make her feel trapped rather than cherished. Now I must reveal the most profound truth Jung discovered about the feminine psyche, one that will transform how you understand every confusing interaction you've experienced in relationships. The female shadow doesn't just influence behavior, it actively seeks confirmation of its worldview. This is the devastating insight that explains why the most loving relationship can suddenly derail. When a woman operates from her unconscious shadow, she will unconsciously orchestrate situations that confirm her deepest fears. If her core wound is abandonment, she will test you with increasing emotional withdrawal until you eventually pull away too, proving her fear correct. If her wound is around not being valued, she'll discount your expressions of appreciation until you become frustrated and stop offering them, again confirming her original belief. This isn't manipulation, it's an unconscious psychological mechanism so powerful that Jung considered it the primary cause of relationship dysfunction. The shadow creates the very reality it fears most. Think about that relationship where everything was going well until it mysteriously unraveled. Remember how confused you felt by her sudden change, how her perception of your actions seemed increasingly distorted. You weren't imagining it. Her shadow loop had activated, interpreting reality through the lens of old wounds rather than present truth. The most heartbreaking aspect of this process is that the woman herself suffers terribly while it unfolds. As her shadow distorts her perception, she genuinely experiences pain, betrayal, and confirmation of her worst fears, even when objectively none of these things are happening. She isn't choosing to see you negatively. Her unconscious is literally filtering her perception. Let me share with you what Jung called the archetypal possession, a state where a woman becomes completely identified with a single archetype, losing access to all other aspects of her feminine nature. This is the moment when you feel like you're suddenly with a completely different person, because in a profound psychological sense, you are. When the terrible mother archetype possesses her consciousness, the nurturing, loving woman you know transforms into someone who seems to want to suffocate your independence or criticize your every move. When the dark queen takes over, her need for control becomes absolute, interpreting any boundary you set as a threat to her authority. When the wounded maiden emerges, her vulnerability becomes a weapon, making any attempt to address problems feel like you're attacking someone defenseless. Jung documented how these archetypal possessions create specific relationship patterns. The woman possessed by her terrible mother archetype will smother then resent, nurture then punish. The dark queen will elevate, then devalue you, making you feel alternatively special and worthless. The wounded maiden will invite rescue then reject the very support she demanded. What makes these patterns so confusing is that they contradict her conscious intentions. In her aware moments, she genuinely wants connection, authenticity, and mutual growth. But when the archetypes possess her, these conscious desires are completely overridden by ancient psychological patterns Jung traced back through centuries of feminine experience. The shadow loop functions like a psychological immune system gone wrong. It's designed to protect her from repeating past hurts, but paradoxically ensures those very experiences continue. This explains the painful cycle you've perhaps witnessed. Her fear of being controlled leads her to reject guidance, creating situations where she feels lost and needs direction, which then triggers her fear of being controlled again. The loop perpetuates itself with devastating efficiency. Jung's revolutionary insight was that this pattern continues until consciousness interrupts it. Until a woman recognizes her shadow patterns, integrates her negative animus, and heals the wounded archetypes within her psyche, she remains trapped in this loop, not because she wants to, but because the unconscious always dominates until it's brought into awareness. This is why the same relationship patterns repeat despite her conscious desire for something different. It's why promises to change emotional reactions rarely hold. The conscious mind simply cannot override these deeper patterns without the profound inner work Jung prescribed. The most profound revelation in Jung's work on feminine psychology is what he called the autonomous complex. The discovery that these shadow patterns eventually become self-operating systems that function independently of conscious intention. They literally take on a life of their own within the psyche. This explains why even the most insightful, therapy-experienced woman can find herself repeatedly acting from her shadow, despite her best intentions and deepest awareness. You've likely experienced the bewildering pain of watching a woman you care about switch between these autonomous complexes, loving you deeply in one moment, then treating you like an enemy the next, then perhaps becoming coldly indifferent, all within a short period. This isn't emotional instability in the conventional sense. It's different shadow complexes activating and deactivating in response to unconscious triggers neither of you fully perceive. The shadow loop explains why intelligent, self-aware, loving women still find themselves creating the very relationship dynamics they consciously want to avoid. It's not a flaw in character. It's the power of the unconscious operating exactly as Jung described, creating what he called fate, the seemingly inevitable repetition of painful patterns until consciousness transforms them. Now that you've glimpsed the profound machinery of the feminine unconscious, you stand at a crossroads. You can continue to experience these patterns as personal rejection, or you can recognize them as the universal psychological processes Jung mapped a century ago. This knowledge doesn't excuse harmful behavior in relationships. Rather, it offers a framework for understanding that transforms confusion into clarity. When you witness a shadow eruption, you can now see it for what it is, not a true rejection of you, but an unconscious pattern seeking confirmation of old wounds. Jung taught that real transformation begins with awareness. For the woman in your life, this means the painful but liberating process of confronting her shadow, integrating her negative animus, and healing the wounded archetypes that drive her unconscious behavior. For you, it means developing the psychological vision to recognize these patterns without taking them personally. The shadow loop isn't destiny, it's a pattern that can be interrupted. But this interruption requires something rare in our quick-fix culture: the courage to look unflinchingly at the darker aspects of the psyche. As Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What would it mean for your relationships if you could recognize these shadow patterns as they emerge? Imagine being able to see beyond the surface behavior to the wounded archetype beneath. Consider how differently you might respond to her sudden withdrawal if you understood it as her abandoned child archetype, seeking confirmation of its fears, rather than a rejection of you. This psychological insight transforms the very nature of love itself. Instead of loving only the conscious aspects of a woman, the parts she readily shows the world, you begin to hold space for her entire psyche, including the shadow elements she herself struggles to accept. This is what Jung meant by true intimacy, not just connecting with someone's conscious identity, but developing the capacity to witness their whole psychological reality without judgment. In practical terms, this awareness gives you choices where before you had only reactions. When her negative animus projects criticism onto your supportive comments, you can now recognize the projection rather than defending against an attack that isn't actually about you. When her terrible mother archetype emerges to control the relationship, you can set boundaries without rejecting her as a person. The greatest gift of Jung's insights is liberation from taking these shadow dynamics personally. The woman in your life isn't choosing these reactions. She's experiencing the autonomous operation of psychological complexes that function independently of her conscious will. Understanding this transforms blame into compassion, confusion into clarity. Remember the last relationship conflict that left you completely bewildered. Revisit it through this Jungian lens. The moment she suddenly withdrew after increasing closeness. The time your genuine compliment was met with suspicion. The conversation that mysteriously spiraled into chaos despite your best intentions. In each case, you were witnessing not personal rejection, but the operation of shadow dynamics Jung meticulously documented. I want you to consider something revolutionary. What if these painful interactions weren't failures but invitations? Jung believed that relationship challenges are precisely where the unconscious reveals itself most clearly. Each shadow eruption presents an opportunity for both partners to develop greater consciousness, if they have the psychological framework to recognize what's actually happening. The most transformative relationships, according to Jung, are those where both partners commit to this consciousness work together, where the man doesn't simply react to the woman's shadow with his own, but develops the capacity to witness her psychological process with compassion while maintaining clear boundaries, where the woman doesn't simply blame the man for triggering her wounds, but takes responsibility for bringing her shadow elements into consciousness. How might your relationship transform if, instead of reacting to her shadow with your own, you responded with understanding of the deeper pattern unfolding? What if, rather than feeling bewildered by her emotional shifts, you could recognize which archetype or animus aspect was active in the moment? This isn't about manipulation or control. It's about seeing beyond the surface of relationship dynamics to the deeper psychological currents Jung mapped so precisely. It's about compassion for the unconscious patterns that drive behavior until consciousness interrupts them. The ultimate truth Jung discovered is both challenging and liberating. Relationships fail not because people don't love each other enough, but because they remain unconscious of the shadow patterns operating beneath their conscious intentions. Love alone cannot transform these patterns. Only consciousness can. Think about how this knowledge might transform your approach to connection. Instead of seeking a woman without these shadow elements, an impossibility, according to Jung, you develop the psychological capacity to navigate them consciously. Instead of being repeatedly bewildered by the same patterns, you recognize them as they emerge and respond from awareness rather than reaction. This is the gift Jung offers men struggling to understand the feminine psyche. Not a technique for controlling women's emotions, but a profound framework for witnessing the full spectrum of feminine psychological experience with clarity and compassion. Has this exploration of Jungian psychology illuminated patterns you've experienced in your relationships? Share your insights in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another viewer needs to understand their own experience. If these psychological truths resonated with you, support our continued exploration by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And don't miss our previous videos on male archetypes and the hero's journey. Understanding both masculine and feminine psychology creates the complete map Jung offered for human transformation. Remember, the shadow loop isn't a sentence to perpetual confusion in relationships. It's a pattern that loses power once recognized. In bringing these unconscious dynamics into awareness, you take the first step toward the authentic connection that becomes possible when shadows no longer rule from the darkness.